All right, welcome in to another Beyond the Arc. I'm Bill Reiter, and Sam Quinn is here because John Gonzalez is on a well-deserved vacation. Sources, I don't know if this is true, Sam, but I think he might. He's in England watching soccer matches. He's probably with some English hooligans right now, tearing down a pub somewhere, going crazy. You know how Amish people they let their kids kind of go crazy right before they become adults. This is John's thing before the NBA season. Just goes nuts in England.
We're off the rails, 15 seconds in? I wasn't expecting to go in this direction. I kind of feel for John because if there's ever a time where it feels safe to take a vacation working in basketball,
Right.
it's September. This is not on John. He couldn't have known.
September surprise, you probably know by now. Karl Anthony Towns, it's not official, it hasn't gone through, but he's going to be a New York Knick. Julius Randle's going back the other way to the Timberwolves, along with DiVincenzo and a first round pick. And you said it. I mean, this is why by the way, the happiest person in America was Adrian Wojnarowski on that night because he looked at his phone and he goes, it's not my problem. And he went back to St. Bonnie's or whatever he's doing. All right, so my first reaction was I kind of hated it for the Knicks and kind of hated it for the Timberwolves. I've evolved in that a little bit, Sam. We'll get into all those things. We'll break down how each of us feel about this trade for both New York and for Minnesota. But for people that are not aware, the CBA, as it's now constructed, is highly punitive for teams that get themselves into some cap trouble. Can you just give us maybe a refresher or a perspective on the numbers behind this and the pressures that led Minnesota to move on from obviously their talented big man?
Yeah, Minnesota, I mean, look, there are going to be all sorts of arguments about how they had a chance to win the championship. You don't break up a team like that after 1 year. They had to do this. The way their cap was situated, they were a second apron team this year by a wide margin with a huge luxury tax bill. That's just something the owner is going to have to deal with. We'll get into ownership in a little bit. But they were really positioned where they were going to be a second apron team next year. And if you're a second apron team more than 3 out of 5 years, that's when you start having draft picks go to the end of the first round. Obviously, every year that you're above the second apron, you don't have that same maneuverability as far as trades go.
Yep.
It was going to happen in some form where they were going to become cheaper over the next few years. I think they looked at what was happening in New Orleans with Brandon Ingram, where the Pelicans have a 26, 27-year-old all-star who they can't move because everybody is afraid to pay him in this new environment. And they thought if this season doesn't go well, teams are going to look at Karl Anthony Towns and his 4-year supermax and say, we cannot touch that contract. The way they probably looked at this was, we might not be getting what we'd consider an ideal return for Towns now, but we can move him. If in a year this season doesn't go well, we might not be able to move him at all. And at that point, if you have Towns on a supermax, if you have Anthony Edwards on a Rose Rule max, and Rudy Gobert is a player option for the 25-26 season, there are a number of things you could do. You could maybe let him go after 2 years. You could re-sign him at a lower rate for longer years. But they were going to be very, very expensive. And if you have those three guys, well, now Naz Reid is walking on his player option. Now Nickeil Alexander-Walker is leaving as a free agent. Now maybe you have to start asking some hard questions about, can we afford to have Jaden McDaniels? This isn't the Knicks. This isn't the Lakers, right? Like, even if you put aside the functional roster building issues that come with being over the second apron this many years in a row, you also have the cash in it, right? Like, Minnesota is not a market that is going to pay $100 million tax fees every year. So,
well, and let me jump in just to add that context because there's also a lawsuit going on between two prospective ownership groups, or one owner and an ownership group with Mark Lore and A-Rod. And to your point, we don't even know, Sam, who's going to own this team. The conventional wisdom is that Mark Lore and Alex Rodriguez are probably going to win in court. We don't know. I'm not a lawyer. That's just what people around the NBA suspect is going to happen. We don't know how much money they want to spend. The Timberwolves have traditionally been a very cheap organization. And even if they win in court, you still have to have the other 29 owners agree to a sale over the wishes of a guy they've done business with for decades. So there's an ownership component to this too that's interesting. And Tim Connolly, who's the GM, basically has an out if he wants to leave. And I was talking to another general manager over the weekend who said it's hard to gauge whether or not Tim is trying to shave some money off the books to make life easier for Lore and A-Rod, because they're going to need to show on a balance sheet, as I understand it. Do they have the cash flow? That's why they brought in Michael Bloomberg and I think a dude from Google to basically provide some money if they get the team. So if you bring the numbers down, I think it makes it easier for them to get the sale to go through. But is Connolly really facilitating what is in the best interest of potentially two different ownership groups, or is he just operating to build the best team? So you're right. There's money, and there's also sort of the machinations and the politics of this ownership situation at play.
Yeah, so Woj reported, I think in April or May, that when Lauren Arod were going to buy the team, there were documents that showed they wanted to duck the luxury tax entirely for the 24-25 season, which basically would have been impossible. I mean, look, nothing's impossible in the NBA. That was obviously very unlikely. We don't know all of the details here. We can't say for certain what anybody's plans are. And plans in the NBA can change very frequently. If they win the championship, obviously things change. But it seems like this ownership group is not super enthused about paying years and years and years of deep luxury taxes. So this is a move that sets them up. If they want to just let Julius Randle walk, either after this season with his player option or a year later, they can do that. If they want to trade him and fill that salary slot with somebody else, that's an easier number to move than Karl Towns at 50 plus million with 4 years left on the deal. Right? They have a lot more flexibility now. There are even scenarios, if you really wanted to get crazy, where they could have significant cap space in 26. If next year, if those don't work out and you have to really significantly reshape the team, you can do it. And Anthony Edwards, I know it's Minnesota. I know we're going to hear, oh, nobody's going to want to go play in Minnesota. Anthony Edwards is going to be a pretty effective recruiter over the next few years if they wanted to chase somebody. I mean, look, Kevin Love went to Cleveland. Let
me jump in real quick because I want to circle back to the Woj report. And let me say, I like Adrian. He's a friend. Like, he's a great guy. I will just say on the report about Lauren Arod maybe wanting to duck the luxury tax and the implication being potentially at the time gut this sort of rising team. Glenn Taylor, who's the owner currently, he doesn't exactly have a reputation for being Scrooge McDuck and spending money. And there were certainly people out there in the NBA who thought that maybe not the report wasn't true, but maybe that report came from sources that spoke to Woj in an attempt to make this other ownership group look bad. Because if you're Glenn Taylor and you're trying to make these other dudes look cheap, I mean, it's kind of the pot calling the kettle black. So there's all these really interesting implications. And I think you make a really good point about the flexibility potentially that Minnesota's put together financially, either to reshape the team for basketball reasons or to just duck spending a bunch of money, depending who wins this ownership battle and what they want to do in terms of the financial commitment it might take to win in Minnesota.
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing to remember here is Anthony Edwards is what matters. That's the timeline that you're operating under.
He's the cornerstone.
And the way they were set up was we're going to be very, very good this year, right around where they were a year ago, where they won 57 games and they made the Western Conference Finals. But it was going to get harder as time went on because Towns is not old, but older. Rudy Gobert is in the back half of his prime. Like, the way they were set up was that this year, when Anthony Edwards is in his 5th season, was probably going to be their best chance, barring something surprising. I think it makes more sense to set yourself up to be in the mix this year, but then year 6, year 7, year 8, year 9, you have maneuverability. You have the ability to put the right team around him then. I think in any given NBA season, unless you're like the Durant Warriors, you're never going to have more than like a 20% chance at winning the title. Yeah. I think generally it makes more sense to say, let's give ourselves 5 shots at 10% than 1 at 18.
Since we're talking money, by the way, it's worth just quickly noting the reason the Knicks can do this in part and spend the money on Cat is because Jalen Brunson, inexplicably, but I love it, John didn't, left a lot of money on the table to build a winner. And the Knicks have taken that flexibility he afforded them by not taking all the money that he could have. And they've done that. So we are going to get into whether or not this works for New York. We'll give it a grade or at least a perspective, whether or not it works for the Timberwolves, how this affects each of these teams with Cat going to New York City and Julius Randle and Donnie DiVincenzo and that first-round pick going the other direction when we come back next year on Beyond the Arc.
A Quiet Place Day 1 is now streaming on Paramount+. It's thrilling, terrifying. It will make your heart pound out of your chest. A Quiet Place Day 1, now streaming.
All right, welcome back into Beyond the Arc. Remember to subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcast. Give us a 5-star review, leave your comments, and tell your friends, homing pigeons, all that fun stuff. Spread the word. So let's start with the Knicks. My first reaction was I didn't like it for New York City because I'm not a huge Cat guy. I don't have an issue with him per se. I'm not a huge believer that he is a huge cornerstone to success. And I've been saying for years on various parts of CBS Sports HQ and the radio show that I do that if I was Minnesota, I probably would have traded him before the emergence of Ant. But I mean, this New York team is a super team now by every, I think, definition in the modern NBA. I think some of the things that are problematic for Cat can be covered up. I'm coming around to being all in on this. I mean, you're talking about a starting five of Brunson, Hart, Bridges, Anunoby, and Cat with still a lot of depth. Are you? Do you want to talk me into Knicks are at the Boston Celtics level or close, or are you more like our producer Aaron, who does not like this?
Yeah, I'm in favor of this trade for the Knicks. All of the Cat skepticism, I think, is generally warranted. This is the absolute perfect basketball situation for him. Think about all of the things he either rarely had in Minnesota or never had in Minnesota. He didn't have a really good all-star caliber guard until Anthony Edwards emerged. Really this year, maybe last year. Well, now he has Jalen Brunson. He was never on Minnesota teams that had really elite shooting all over the floor. He now has that in New York. He now has some of the best perimeter defenders in the NBA around him to help protect him defensively. I think there are some defensive question marks here. I mean, he's not a rim protector. He is going to be playing center here, presumably. I think having these great point of attack defenders is going to open a lot of stuff up. I think if you look back to how they played defense in Minnesota before Rudy Gobert got there, there are some interesting things Tom Thibodeau can take from that. Maybe he's defending at the level more. Maybe they're blitzing more. They're hedging. They're playing more aggressive pick and roll defense. But I think you can generally figure that out because this offense is going to be awesome. I think This is either the best or the second best offense in the NBA right now. Maybe third. Porzingis being hurt dings Boston a little bit. I think if you were to just say who's going to rank at the top of the league at the end of the year, I would think New York and Dallas are probably number one and number two. Not only is Karl-Anthony Towns a great shooter, there are all of these elements of his game that he couldn't really show off playing power forward in Minnesota, playing with lesser guards for most of his career that are now going to be unlocked in New York. He is a great pick and roll finisher. Like, not good, a great pick and roll finisher. He never had the guards to take advantage of that, and he wasn't running pick and roll nearly as often in Minnesota because Rudy Gobert had to. Well, now he's running perfectly spaced pick and rolls with Jalen Brunson as his guard. Good luck defending that. I don't know what you're going to do about that. There's going to be so much more space for him to work in the post. It's much easier to work in the post as a center than as a power forward playing next to a center because you're not going to have the lane nearly as clogged. I don't know. All of your skepticism about Towns in general, it's warranted. I get it. For most teams, I would be skeptical. This is the team that it makes sense for.
Look, so last year they were a top 10. They're a top 10 offense. They have the potential to be. Wouldn't it be weird for Tom Thibodeau to have a number one or number two or number three offense in the NBA? He certainly can. I mean, he is. And the other thing about this is that they're in an arms race with Boston. I mean, Boston was on paper last year one of the most impressive champions in the history of the NBA, just in terms of like how they won, the number of games, point differential, every way that you want. They were utterly outstanding. And so in some ways, this is Leon Rose, who we haven't mentioned, and I should give credit. When he came over from CAA, and I knew him a little bit, he's sort of a J.D. Salinger type. He's very reclusive. He wasn't as reclusive as an agent. He's basically impossible to ever speak to now. There was some skepticism in the NBA. I certainly had some skepticism. This is a coup. And the only thing that sort of makes me a little nervous is that at every step, Leon Rose has built a winner, has been dispassionate as best we can sort of figure it out and unscramble what he's thinking, has changed a terrible culture into a great culture. He's close with Karl-Anthony Towns. I mean, this is a person he has a long-standing relationship with. And so if anyone is not going to see Cat's faults, it's going to be Leon Rose. I'm with you. I think it's the right move. I'll just say that the Knicks are all in, Leon's all in, and the pressure on Cat's going to be a lot different than it was in Minnesota. I know you've interacted with Cat, and I have, and maybe you've had a little bit different experiences. My view of Karl Anthony Towns, and I know the view of some people, not everybody, is that he's very smart, but he's a very sensitive, sometimes thin-skinned guy who can maybe feel like he's a little bit smarter than the other people in the room. And if things go well, I don't think that matters. But if things go badly, if they struggle, I'm very curious how Karl Anthony Towns takes the criticism and the scrutiny and the massive expectations. Because for me, Sam, New York's got to compete to be the top team in the Eastern Conference in the regular season. And I think conference finals is the bare minimum of what has to be expected given the roster that they put together.
Yeah, I agree in that I think these first 20-25 games are going to set a very important tone here. We saw how much Julius Randle struggled with the scrutiny in New York, right? Like, ultimately, it was a love-hate relationship. I don't think Julius Randle wanted to leave New York. I think he'll benefit from being out of that spotlight a little bit. I think if the Knicks race out of the gate at 17-8, Towns is going to be the toast of New York. If they struggle coming out, he's going to get the brunt of this, right? Like, Knicks fans loved Dante DiVincenzo. He was, other than Jeremy Lin, maybe the most popular one-year Knick ever. So
that's a great call. Yeah.
If this doesn't work out quickly, it's going to be difficult. What I'll say about the Leon Rose side of this is, remember, he saw something in Jalen Brunson that nobody else in the NBA saw.
I didn't see it.
I didn't either. I remember we were doing radio shows back in the day saying, like, I think this is a little much, right?
Right.
I think it's possible that when you know somebody, I would say Leon Rose probably knows Karl Anthony Towns better than almost any other general manager in the NBA. He has a better idea of how he's going to react to this. Now, there are still some questions, and this is going to be a very different sort of Knicks team, right? Like, the Knicks have generally ranked pretty well in offense over the last few years, but they've done that primarily as an offensive rebounding team. With Randle gone, with Hartenstein gone, with Mitchell Robinson hurt, it's going to be different. Now, that said, I do want to point out, Josh Hart playing with 4 elite shooters, he might lead the NBA in offensive rebounding, or at least lead wings in it. He is going to be so frustrating for opposing teams to deal with when there's this kind of spacing around him. I mean, he's going to drive opposing team nuts. I'm very excited for that. It's just a Josh Hart enjoyer alone.
You make a great point about Leon Rose having earned the benefit of the doubt with Jalen Brunson, and with that sort of context, knowing Cat. And producer Aaron points out that, and this is worth saying, Tibbs coached Cat in Minnesota, and so there's a familiarity that's there as well. So Mitchell Robinson surplus to requirements now whenever he's healthy, isn't he? I mean, to me, it just seems like moving him would make a lot of sense. Do you keep him on if you're playing GM? I don't think that I do.
I think the really hard thing about this is that they're so invested in this year and starting quickly that having a player who's going to miss the first 2 or 3 months of the season is really hard to swallow. Like, even if you're taking a slight downgrade in terms of production, getting that guy for a full season versus getting A, half of this season at most for Mitch, and B, like, there's no guarantee that he's going to stay healthy after that, given his history. So if there is something out there, I'd love for them to get another shooter. Losing DiVincenzo is going to hurt. Like, everybody else in their starting lineup is a good to great shooter. But Dante was a movement shooter. He was somebody you could more easily draw up plays for. That's not really the case with the rest of these guys. So I'd love to see them get another shooter, maybe another shot-creating guard. You do lose a little bit in the creation element when Towns is a better overall offensive player than Randle. I think Randle is a better creator. So if they could get somebody who could maybe run a few more pick and rolls, I think that would make some sense. I don't think you have to trade Robinson, but I also wonder how much utility are you going to get out of him if Towns is playing 40 minutes primarily at center? Like, they can play together. I don't know that that's optimal.
Let me pitch something to you that I've been thinking about, and you tell me whether you think this is legitimate or not, because I haven't really decided if this is sort of what I want, how I want to enter thinking about the season, but I'm an MVP voter, or at least I have in the last 5 or 6 years, and I try to take that pretty seriously. And I was thinking about when this trade happened, how significant Jalen Brunson's sacrifice financially is to bring in Cat and to bring in Bridges and just like allows it. Is it reasonable? I am considering, obviously it needs to be based on performance as well, but basically giving Jalen Brunson a boost in my MVP ballot early on if the Knicks are great, because he's going to be the most important player on that team. And he also facilitated creating the best roster possible by literally leaving tens and tens and tens of $1 million. And if that's not leadership and that's not value, I don't know what is. I know I've said it twice now. I want to say it 3 times. In an era where everybody gets their money and gets theirs, and you should, I understand why, Jalen Brunson is literally sacrificing generational wealth in order to try and create a championship-level team in New York City. It's amazing.
I've had that same internal dialogue about MVP. I'm not a voter, but I do think it's reasonable because it was a choice that he made. I think if you bring salary into the conversation most of the time, it's a little unfair.
Right, choice.
Where if somebody's on a rookie deal, is that fair to compare them to somebody on a max? No, because they didn't control it. This was a choice that Jalen Brunson made, and I'm comfortable rewarding him for it because that is value created for his team. So I would be open to that. I think I agree with you.
All right. Let's do this. Let's get into I think we both agree New York Knicks 1B now in the Eastern Conference, maybe not quite the Celtics, but they're in that range and they're clearly ahead of Philly and whoever else you want to put on that list.
Yeah, I would say Boston is ahead of them, but they're within the margin of error. I think with good shooting, with good injury luck, it is totally plausible that they could beat Boston. I would set the odds of that series at it depends on home court advantage, of course, but something close to 65-35, 60-40 in favor of Boston.
Oh, my God. This is selfish. I get to go to the finals. I want Knicks finals. So I never thought I'd see that in my lifetime. You brought up Jeremy Lin. I went to those Linsanity. I missed the first maybe 2, but I went to all the other Linsanity games when I was at a different shop. And the Garden, and you're in New York City.
Oh, yeah.
When there's meaningful basketball, and it's rare, there is no place on earth like the Garden in Midtown Manhattan. It is.
I went to Carmelo Anthony's MSG debut. I thought I was gonna die. Yeah. It was so loud.
It's amazing.
There's nothing like it in the sport. We've both been to a lot of arenas. There is nothing like it.
I mean, even a conference finals game 7 would be more exciting at the Garden than most finals games. I cannot wait. All right, so that's the Knicks. We're on the Knicks. Julius Randle plus Dante DiVincenzo equals what in Minnesota? We will tell you next here on Beyond the Arc.
A new crown awaits.
Brilliantly taken.
The journey to become European football royalty has begun.
A stunning goal.
The UEFA Europa League on CBS Sports Network and stream every match live on Paramount+.
All right, welcome back to Beyond the Arc. I'm Bill Reiter. He is Sam Quinn CBS on Twitter. I'm on their sports writer, sports REITER. So you walked us through the ways in which, in the medium long term, Minnesota have set themselves up, Sam, for some flexibility. Obviously, the cornerstone of this organization going forward for hopefully a long time is Anthony Edwards, and that now they have at least feasibly a way to rebuild or sort of build a little bit differently around him in a few years if they choose to do that. Let's focus on this upcoming year. Julius Randle, Dante DiVincenzo, they come into a Minnesota team that I think most of us would have in the top 2 or 3 of our projected Western Conference standings if we were going to do that. How do you Julius Randle and Rudy Gobert is an interesting pairing. There's obviously a vote of confidence here in Naz Reid from Tim Connolly and the organization. In general terms, how do you feel about Minnesota once this trade is official?
I think the starting lineup is worse, but I think the overall team has a chance to be as good or maybe even a little bit better. The Randle-Gobert fit is clunky because Randle, he is a good offensive player and a better creator than Towns. Him not being able to shoot as well as Towns is really, really significant for Minnesota because they're already not a great shooting team. Jaden McDaniels is a below-average shooter for his position. Gobert, obviously not a shooter at all. It's going to be a lot harder for Anthony Edwards to get to the basket in those lineups. But having Randle as a secondary creator for bench lineups is going to be important. I think this trade says a lot more about what Minnesota sees in Naz Reid than what they see in Julius Randle. Because Naz Reid is the Towns analog, right? He's not as good, but the hope is that he can be stylistically similar for you, give you 80% of the production at 50% of the price long term. I wouldn't be surprised to see Naz Reid be more of the maybe not the starter, but the closer at power forward. I wouldn't be surprised if Dante DiVincenzo closed games. Obviously not at power forward, but I don't think Minnesota made this trade thinking Julius Randle is now like our core guy. He's going to be the second or third best player on the team. I think they made the trade thinking, yeah, let's see how this works. And if it works, great. We'll extend him. We'll win with him, yada, yada, yada. I think the creation is important. Look, he was essential. Karl Anthony Towns was essential in the Denver series. They don't beat the Nuggets without Towns. They also fell down 3-0 against Dallas because of Towns, because he shot, I think, 3 of 22 from 3 in those 3 games that they lost by 13 combined points. Randle, you're getting a little bit more stable production out of him because so much of it is near the basket, because he's self-creating it, because he's going to get to the line. Like, I see the idea here, but I don't think Minnesota is utterly dependent on him being as good or as productive as Towns was. I think they now have a little bit more optionality to say, maybe Naz Reid takes a bigger role. Maybe we close with DiVincenzo. Maybe we're a little bit more flexible in matching up lineups against other teams. So lower ceiling, I guess, but I see how they can make it up.
Yeah, so I did a survey of various executives around the NBA, right? Hit up a bunch of GMs and some assistant GMs and various people. Got some on the phone and some just by text. And the general vibe that I got on the sort of Minnesota side of this was nonplussed. The people I talked to, it wasn't doom and gloom. The sky is not falling. It's not Chicken Little running out of his house. But it was, they're worse. I mean, at least in the short term, they are not going to be as good and as dangerous of a basketball team. And one of the things that a couple guys hit me with was just when you get to the playoffs, when you get to the postseason, it is really important to have stars who you can rely on to go out there and just get you buckets and hit big shots and be difference makers in whatever way they can be. And you can agree or disagree whether that is Karl Anthony Towns. I can show you some game logs where he didn't do it, and it can show you some where he did. But he's obviously a massively talented player, and they are not as talented as they were before. So for me, just talking to folks, I think they're still – I think they're on the back end now of that sort of Oklahoma City, Denver – are we putting Dallas ahead of Minnesota now?
I think I'm higher on Dallas than most, but I had a pretty clear hierarchy to me where Oklahoma City was number 1 with a bullet. Then I had Dallas, then I had Minnesota, then I had Denver. I think Minnesota and Denver maybe flip. Maybe you have Denver ahead of them. But I was pretty firm that I was going to have Oklahoma City 1 and Dallas 2.
Yeah, I think it's a step back. And look, you walked us through the CBA realities of sort of why these things are going to happen. This is also part of the deal. You're just going to have teams that are going to be brought down a few levels as they make the financial decisions they have to make. I'm not a huge – I'm a cat skeptic. I also am not – Julius Randle's a fine player if you have the right fit and it's the right spot. I have a colleague. Do you remember this? I have a colleague from radio, from where I work, who thought he was like the new Chris Bosh or better than Chris Bosh. You remember
Not so much.
No, he's not. He's not. So, it's how much of a weight now is on Anthony Edwards, and to what degree, as much as we love him, as much as we celebrate him, do we really think he is ready to be can he be a top 5 player in the NBA next year? I think that's a lot to ask.
Well, there's so much circumstance involved in this, too, where Jalen Brunson is going to be able to glide to the rim with all of that space in New York. Edwards is now going to be playing with 2 non-shooting big men and a non-shooting wing. It's going to be a lot harder for him. I don't think it's necessarily going to be an indictment on him if his numbers go down, if his efficiency goes down. It's just kind of a clunky fit. Now, can you get funky with the lineups? Can you find creative ways to deploy these guys? I think it's worth noting that Chris Finch, had Julius Randle in New Orleans. He knows how to use him. Randle, nobody remembers that season because that was the Anthony Davis demands a trade season. But, Randle was really good that year. He also was in Denver with Nikola Jokic early. He made it work with Towns and Gobert. Chris Finch is a very creative coach when it comes to figuring out how to put awkwardly fitting big men together. So I think Minnesota is about as well suited to making this work as they could be. But ultimately, I think Julius Randle, is a floor raiser rather than a ceiling raiser. He is somebody who very badly needs to have the ball in his hands. That can be very useful for you if you're a 30-win team trying to win 40 games. It could be very useful to you if your bench lineups are dying when your star goes to the bench, which was the case for Minnesota. So I do think Randle can help in that setting. I don't know how useful he's going to be when Anthony Edwards is trying to be Anthony Edwards. And I do wonder if we're going to get 4 or 5 months into the season and they're going to realize maybe Naz Reid has to be the second big next to Gobert, or maybe we have to go small with DiVincenzo.
So like to your point, because Anthony Edwards' usage rate last year was like 32 or 33%, right? And it's going to have to go up almost certainly because he's going to have to carry the offense. Him next to Julius Randle, who also needs the ball in his hands, and Randle playing with Gobert. I mean, I haven't asked enough people, but I am skeptical that that's going to be a lineup that's highly, highly successful.
I would think they will be better in bench lineups than they are in the starting lineup. That's my guess for their season. Now, that said, it's worth noting they now have 3 awesome bench players between DiVincenzo, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and Naz Reid. Like, they go 8 deep with starting caliber players. There is something to be said for that, especially in an NBA that has a lot of injuries now. Like, I do think there are going to be a lot of nights in January and February where, like, oh, well, like, Conley has a stinger and Gobert has a sore shoulder. So, like, I guess it's on you, Julius. Like, those nights, that does matter. Like, there is value to be had in that. So, I think the fit is clunky. And I do think there's a chance we get to February and Minnesota says, well, not working. We're going to trade Randle for, like, a pure shooter or a defensive wing or something else. I don't think it's a lock that he finishes the season on the team, let alone re-signs afterwards. So,
it's an experiment. It's an experiment.
Exactly.
And to your point,
let's not forget the fact they did get a first-round pick in this trade, and I think it's a deceptively valuable one. Like, it's not a high upside pick because of the protections. They had no first-round picks to trade. Like, if you need to make some sort of change at the deadline, you weren't going to be able to do that when you had no first-round picks and a $50 million Karl Anthony Towns contract. Now, if you're shopping Randle at $30 million plus a first-round pick, maybe you can find something that helps in another way.
Maybe there might be 3 levels of trial and error here. You can just throw Randle the starting lineup and see if it works, and maybe it's effective, and maybe everything goes great. You can, if it doesn't, transition him to maybe being more of a guy that leads the second team, comes off the bench, facilitates the offense when Ant is taking his time off. And then if none of the above works, maybe to your point, there's a trade that you can find when you get closer to the trade deadline. There are phases of opportunity to test it out, but it's not the slam dunk that at least it feels like it is for New York City with Cat coming into the bench.
So, you know what the scary thing here is that Randle's in a contract year, where I think if Randle had 4 years left on his deal, you might have an easier time selling him on maybe you should come off the bench. It's very hard to sell a guy of that stature who's made multiple All-NBA teams on a bench role. I think another version of this is going to go on in Dallas, where, like, if you look at the actual lineup construction, there's no reason Klay Thompson should start, right? Like, they should be starting Najee Marshall because they need the defense in the starting lineup. But Klay Thompson is super famous, and you have to go through the motions of starting him for 30 games and saying, oh, here's where the lineup data says it's not going to work. We have to make a change. I don't know if you can do that as easily with Randle because Klay Thompson is in his mid-30s and he has a multi-year contract. Randle's on a, impending free agent.
I hear you, but I mean, I think the expectations in Minnesota have to be championship level expectations if it doesn't work. Also, when guys get kicked to the curb, it's easier to sort of talk yourself into doing. I mean, the Knicks moved on from Julius Randle. I mean, contract year or not, it takes a little bit of the shine off. Did not mention this at the start of the podcast, but I want to. Dikembe Mutombo passed away. That happened today at a very, very young age after a long battle or a battle with brain cancer. I didn't cover the NBA, Sam, when he was playing, but I knew him. I was around him at a bunch of events. He was an ambassador for a long time. And I'll just say that, like, this is one of the most joyous and sweet people you could hope to meet. And the finger wag that made him so famous, I mean, it really epitomized who he was. Obviously, Hall of Famer, incredible defensive player. I think second all time in block shots. I mean, the guy was a fierce basketball player. But there was also a joyousness, right, in the shaking of the finger and all the causes that were important to him and his ambassador role for the NBA. And so obviously thoughts and prayers with his family and everybody who knew and loved him. Was an amazing, amazing dude, even in my short interactions. And, of course, we're thinking of him here on the show. Sam, thank you for – I like the shirt, by the way. People that can't see Sam, if you're listening, you're not watching on our YouTube page, it is – what is it? Is it pink or
it's like
purple?
Between a pink and maroon. I don't think it's a little dark for pink, a little light for maroon. maybe I don't know. I'm not good on my colors.
Violet?
Like I didn't think
I
I'd
don't
expect
know.
to say in my 30s. Violet, maybe. Something in the purple pink family. I don't know. It really pops though.
I have prescription shades that I wear around LA, but I don't wear on camera. And I can't see now. I'm looking at you and I can't do it. Like it's so bright, I can't look directly at the shirt with normal. It looks. So I just went a gray tee. Like you went. I didn't know we were doing colors today. All right. Hopefully John is not hooliganing and but he's having a great time. I think he's doing Arsenal. Are you a soccer guy? You're not, right? Arsenal
No, I'm
PSG
not.
tomorrow.
Unfortunately, I
Amazing.
feel like I should get into it though as a company man.
Super well. You should. It's a great sport. Super well deserved time off for John. He's back, I think, end maybe of next week. For Sam Quinn, I am Bill Reiter. Thank you for listening. This has been another edition of Beyond the Arc.